We flew with British Airways from Manchester via Heathrow to Domodedowo Airport. We're staying in the Hotel National, which is directly across from the Kremlin. Opened in 1903, the hotel has had a varied career, but survived the Soviet era. You can just glimpse St. Basil's Cathedral on the opposite side of Red Square beyond the Kremlin. This is the lobby bar. The Alexandrovsky Room. And our room 244 with its vestibule, bathroom and bedroom. Lenin stayed in the National before he moved into the Kremlin in 1918. The hotel is now managed by Starwood Hotels Luxury Collection. We've booked 4 days of guided tour with Bridge to Moscow, and on the Wednesday morning we're met at the hotel by our wonderful guide Maria. We start with a short orientation of the area around the hotel. This is Tverskaya Street. The Four Seasons Hotel is a reconstruction of the 1930s Moscow Hotel. A corner of the Kremlin Wall, the State Museum of History, and a resurrection gate leading into Red Square. The statue is Marshal Zhukov, who led the Red Army during the Second World War and took Berlin. It represents him leading the victory parade at the end of the war and the throwing down of the captured German standards in front of Stalin. The 17th century Resurrection Gate was demolished in 1931 to allow access to Red Square by heavy military vehicles, but it was rebuilt in 1994. Inside Red Square, facing the Kremlin Wall. Behind the wall here are buildings used by the Russian government. Along this stretch of the wall are the graves of and monuments to people who were important in the Soviet Union. This is Stalin's grave. Yuri Gagarin's ashes are behind this plaque. Lenin's mausoleum containing his embalmed body, which we visited. You can't tell the difference between it and a waxwork. On the opposite side of Red Square is GUM, G-U-M. It was built in 1893 as the Upper Trading Rows to house a large number of shops and stalls. For a large part of the Soviet era, it was known as the Government Universal Store. It's now in private ownership again, and the Russian letters GUM now stand for Main Universal Store. It is in effect a large shopping mall, and in fact these days a very high-end shopping mall. At the southern end of Red Square is St. Basil's Cathedral, officially the Cathedral of the Protecting Veil of the Mother of God. It was built in 1561 by Ivan the Terrible to commemorate his victory over the Mongols. Our self-guided tour starts in the crypt. The plan of the cathedral consists of a central core church surrounded by 8 smaller churches. The 9 churches are linked by an internal gallery. Leaving St. Basil's, we have a view in the distance of one of the 7 Sisters, the Stalinist skyscrapers built just after the war. On the far side of Gum, we're in Nikolskaya Street, and this building was the site of Moscow's first ever printing press. A little further and we've reached Theatre Square, and we're facing the famous Bolshoi Theatre. Facing the Bolshoi is Karl Marx, with his famous inscription, "Workers of all lands unite." We're back in front of Resurrection Gate again, facing our hotel, and we're entering the Alexander Gardens in front of the Kremlin. Here we find the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is a monument to all those who died in the Second World War. And every hour, on the hour, the guard is changed. The grotto is built from rubble from buildings destroyed during the French occupation of Moscow. Trinity Tower is our way in for our visit to the Kremlin. The State Kremlin Palace was opened in 1961 for party congresses. Now it's used for concerts and performances. The yellow building is the Arsenal. In front of us, the Senate building, and to the right, the presidential administration under restoration. This enormous cannon was cast in 1586, but was never used in warfare. The Cathedral of the Assumption. The world's largest bell was damaged during casting in 1737. The Ivan the Terrible Bell Tower and the Assumption Belfry. Yuri Gagarin planted this oak tree 2 days after his spaceflight in 1961. The Cathedral of the Annunciation with the armoury behind. We are now standing in Cathedral Square, surrounded by the cathedrals of the Kremlin. The museum in the State Armoury represents wealth collected by the Tsars over many years. After our visit, we exit to the Alexander Gardens. The water features and sculptures are attached to the large underground shopping mall of a Kotny Riad. The long building in the background is the Manege, which was originally a military parade ground in the early 19th century and is now used for exhibitions. Almost opposite our hotel is the home of the Duma, the lower house of the Russian Parliament. On Thursday we had a driving tour of Moscow, with Maria as our guide again and Vladimir our driver for the day. We're passing by the house where the Romanov family lived before they became the royal family of Russia. Looking at the Kremlin from the far side of the Moscow River. We're now approaching the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. Originally built between 1839 and 1884 to commemorate the deliverance of Moscow from the French army, the original building was demolished in 1931. It was rebuilt between 1994 and 1997. A statue of Tsar Alexander II, known as the Liberator, this commemorates his freeing the serfs. An elaborate statue of Peter the Great will get a closer view later. Our next stop is at a controversial statue called Children Are the Victims of Adult Vices. It was put here in 2001. It depicts 13 vices, such as alcoholism and drug addiction, encircling the two innocent children. On Moscow's Lovers Bridge, unlike other cities, couples put their padlock on a metal tree, and when the tree is full, it's moved to the riverbank. Time for a closer look at the enormous statue of Peter the Great, 94 meters high. The sculptor is a personal friend of a former mayor of Moscow, and as a result he has some commissions in very prominent places around the city. From this spot, another good view of Christ the Saviour Cathedral. We're in a sculpture park on the south bank of the Moscow River. It includes representations from Russian folk tales, as well as other quirky stuff. This is Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr. What's really interesting, though, are the statues of former Soviet leaders, which have been put here having been taken down from their original prominent places in various Russian cities. Lots of Lenins. Kosygin and Brezhnev. This modern piece represents victims of the totalitarian regime. Continuing our tour by car, we're about to pass an impressive statue of Yuri Gagarin. We've come to Sparrow Hills, a viewpoint overlooking the centre of Moscow. That's the Olympic Stadium from the 1980 Games. And that's a ski jump dating from the mid-1950s. Moscow City is the new high-rise financial centre. Moscow University, another of Stalin's seven sisters. Victory Park was completed in 1995 for the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. The monument to the Goddess of Victory is 142 metres high. St. George slaying the dragon is a traditional Russian emblem. After lunch, we visit Novodevichy Convent just south of the city centre, founded in 1524 to commemorate the capture of Smolensk. The oldest part of the convent is the Cathedral of the Virgin of Smolensk, and for a change we are allowed to take photographs in here. The Church of the Assumption was added in the 1680s. Next to the convent is Novodevichy Cemetery, where many leading Russians are buried. This is the grave of Boris Yeltsin. The cellist Mstislav Rostropovich and his wife Galina Vishnevskaya. This chap was a popular entertainer. The military leaders of the defence of Moscow during the Second World War. Anton Chekhov. On Friday, we're taken on a long car ride about 50 miles north of Moscow to Sergeyev Posad. We stop on the way to visit the dacha of Antonin Mikhailovich, which he has decorated in traditional Russian style using plastic offcuts from the factory where he used to work. For a modest contribution, Antonin allows passing visitors to come in and admire his work and also his large fruit and vegetable garden. Aged 74, Antonin manages all the work, helped by his wife and his 16-year-old daughter. The Trinity Monastery of St. Sergius was founded in the mid-14th century by St. Sergius himself. They're about to celebrate the 700th anniversary of the saint's birth, so a lot of sprucing up was going on. The monastery complex includes several churches. This is Trinity Cathedral, dating from the early 15th century. The Cathedral of the Assumption, dating from the mid-16th century. The bell tower is from the mid-18th century. The tomb of Tsar Boris Godunov, who died in 1605. Time to head out now, and after lunch, the long drive back to Moscow. This is the All-Russian Exhibition Center, known by its Russian initials VDNK. Originally planned in the 1930s to showcase Soviet agriculture, it was developed after the war into a more general exhibition area. After years of neglect, it's being refurbished again. The aerospace exhibition includes a Vostok rocket and a Tupolev Tu-154 airliner. This Buran space shuttle has just arrived and has yet to be reassembled. Mikhail Gorbachev cancelled this project before any manned flights had been undertaken. The upside-down house seems quite new. The site occupies an area larger than the state of Monaco. The pavilions of Karelia and Armenia. Saturday morning, our last day with Maria, and we're taken on a tour of some of Moscow's metro stations. Revolution Square station opened in 1938. It has a total of 76 bronze statues representing various people of the Soviet Union, soldiers, border guards, workers and so on. The type of artwork varies from station to station. There's stucco, murals, bas-reliefs, mosaics, but those built in the Stalinist era are all heroic in style. The monument to the conquerors of space, clad in titanium. Busts of space firsts. First man in space, first woman in space, first spacewalk. Sergei Korolev, the father of the Soviet space program. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, an early Russian pioneer in space science. The relief sculpture represents all those who worked towards the first spaceflight. Underneath the monument is a museum. A full-size model of Sputnik 1, the first satellite to orbit the Earth. Full-size model of the capsule that took the first dog, Laika, into space. Stuffed space dogs Belka and Strelka, who were returned to Earth in a module like this. Full-size model of the Vostok capsule that was used for Yuri Gagarin's first spaceflight. The final stage of the cosmonauts' return to Earth in those days was via ejector seat and parachute. A scale model of the Buran space shuttle. A full-size mock-up of the Mir space station. Inside Mir. A Soyuz descent module. A representation of a re-entry that went off course, and the cosmonauts had to wait some time to be rescued. Lunar exploration vehicle. Spacesuit of the American astronaut Michael Collins, which he presented to the museum. Soyuz orbital and descent module, still in use today. This is the only way to get to and from the International Space Station. After lunch we take the metro to Kolomenskaya. This is a vast park which includes a reconstruction of a wooden summer palace that was originally built here by the Tsar Alexis I. By mid-afternoon it was getting very hot, so we went back to the city centre and said our final goodbyes to our wonderful guide Maria. Monday morning we leave the hotel early by foot, heading for Arbat Street. We're passing the Manege with the dome of Christ the Redeemer in the background. This is the Russian State Library. The statue is of Dostoevsky. About half an hour after leaving the hotel, we've reached Arbat Street. In the 19th century, this area was the haunt of intellectuals and artists. Now it's being revived as a tourist destination. An old Moskvich car being used as an advertisement for a shop. In a small square, a statue of Pushkin, and on the edge of the same square, the residence of the US ambassador. The Melnikov House is an unusual cylindrical structure built in the 1920s. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs looms behind Pushkin's house, and in front of it a statue of Pushkin and his wife. Pushkin's house is a museum, but closed on Mondays. This is where we turn round and head back to the hotel. After lunch we set off to explore the area just east of Red Square, starting with the Old English Court. This is where Ivan the Terrible allowed English merchants to settle. Unfortunately, it's now under restoration. The Church of St. George is next to the house of the Romanov boyars. This was the home of the Romanov family until 1613, when Mikhail Romanov became Tsar and moved the family to the Kremlin. Tsar Nicholas I had the house restored in the middle of the 19th century, and it's now a museum. It contains many original artifacts pertaining to the Romanov family. This is the dining room. The upper story of the house was given over to the women's quarters. In the 16th century, the women of noble families would be kept busy weaving, sewing, embroidering. This was a room for the unmarried men of the family. The stone cellar, the oldest part of the house. Re-emerging into the hot sunshine, we can see one of Stalin's skyscrapers. We continue our stroll in this part of Moscow. We've reached Lubyanka Square and the headquarters of the former KGB, now the headquarters of the current Russian Security Service. Turning round, we're at the head of Nikolaevsky Street. Once a thriving commercial hub, this street is now being restored. And at the far end of Nikolaevsky Street, we find ourselves once again at GUM, on the corner of Red Square. And that's the end of our week in Moscow. It's been a great trip, helped enormously by our guide Maria from Bridge to Moscow.